First up is the ISO dial on the camera. So on the top left portion of the shoulder of the camera is our ISO dial. This is a manual dial like we haven't seen in many years. Now it is a locking pin in the middle. This is kind of like a pin where you can press it down and it is locked there, or you can unpress it and turn it off. If I point it over here, you might be able to see it a little bit better. When it's in the downward position, it's totally locked, and when it's up, you can leave it. All right, so let's talk about the various ISO settings that we have. And so the range that we're going to have is 160 to 12,800 is kind of our default starting. So let's go through what some of the particulars here. We do have an A setting, and this is for auto ISO. And this is where whatever shutter speed and aperture you have set through whatever mechanism, the camera will automatically figure out the ISO according to the light levels. And it is often looking at shutter speeds to make sure that you have the right speed. And so that's where it's kind of basing some of its information on. Now within the auto option, there are actually 3 settings for auto that you can have, depending on what parameters you want to put on in the auto ISO. So what I want to do is I want to show you real quickly, we're going to dive into the menu, so we're kind of jumping ahead here. So that, let's just get that focused for a moment. So if we do want to have an auto ISO on the camera, there's a few different options. So if we hit the menu and we jump over and go down to the camera and go down to page 2, we're looking for ISO auto settings. ISO auto setting over here. We have 3 different options. We have auto 1, auto 2, and auto 3. And so these are just kind of 3 favorites. If we go to the right, you see the arrow there to the right, we're going to go to the right. We can change the default sensitivity, the maximum sensitivity, and where the minimum shutter speed is at. So let's just say in this one, we're very particular about ISO, and we only want it to go up to 400 ISO. And let's go to number 2, and this one's at 1600, so that's good. Let's just leave that one be. And let's go to auto 3, and let's bump this one up to 12,800. So these are very different setups for having the camera control the auto ISO. And so now on the top of the camera, we can select in, release our pin, we can select in an A setting here, and this is going to be whatever primary automated setting that we want to have in there, whatever selected auto ISO we have. And so we get to choose which one of those 3 favorites we have, and then when we turn it to A, we can magically get to it. Now switching back and forth, we can do that. We'll get to that in just a moment. All right, next up, 160. That is the native or base sensitivity of the sensor. If you want to get the most information off this sensor, you want to get the highest quality information, this is where you set it. And so this is kind of the default setting where I like to keep it set most of the time, unless I'm needing a faster shutter speed or some other difference in the exposure setting. So then we go through the regular ISO settings, which is going to increase the sensitivity of the sensor, and it's going to allow you to work under lower lights and with faster shutter speeds. And you'll adjust as needed according to what you're shooting. And then we have a C mode, and this is custom, and this is where you can select various high settings, various low settings, and various auto settings. And so let me show you on the back of the camera. Well, let me show you on the top of the camera first. We're going to go ahead and select it into the C mode. I'll go ahead and lock it in there just to make sure we're good and well locked in there. And if we look on the back of the camera, now you'll see, and let me see if I can do something to darken this image up here just a bit. I'm changing the exposure down a little bit with exposure compensation. We'll deal with that in a moment. What I want is I just wanted you to be able to see that the ISO is now controlled by the front dial. Because on the top of the camera we have it in C, so now with the front dial we can control our ISO. If we wanted the lowest setting at 160, we could have it here, and then we can dial up to 12,800, which on the top of the camera is our highest setting. But we can also dive into our auto settings. Remember auto 1 we set as a 400 ISO maximum limit, and number 2 was at 1600, and number 3 was at 12,800. So there are our different auto ISO settings that we can get to. And so we can just change the ISO with our front dial if we have this top one set in custom. If we just want to set it manually ourselves, I can turn the dial on top, and you'll see on the back of the camera that the numbers are turning appropriately. And so it depends on if you want to be able to do it with the dial on the front of the camera or the dial on the top of the camera. And this is a theme that you're going to see repeated throughout this class, is that there's options. You can do it this way or you can do it that way. And that's one of the great things about Fuji's, is that you can adjust them in many different ways. Now, as far as the ISOs themselves, let's do a little look at how good a quality it is. So the sensor on this camera is quite good under low light conditions. The ISOs up to 1600 are all very good quality in my opinion, and you should feel pretty free using these, knowing that you're not going to get much noise or that grainy look in the shadow areas. As you get higher than that, definitely 25,000, 51,000 is going to be a little bit on the rough side. But I think that kind of tapers down around 6,400. And so even 3,200 is very good on this camera. 6,400 and up is where you're going to start noticing that grain in the shadow areas. Now, one of the areas that I wanted to check on this camera is how good the camera is at either recovering highlights or recovering shadows. And what I'm trying to figure out is, are you better off underexposing or overexposing on this camera? So I did a test where I shot this photo at ISO 160, and then keeping the same shutter speeds and apertures, I raised the ISO up to 1600. And so one of these pictures is underexposed and one is overexposed. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take them into post-production and I'm going to try to recover information. So I'm going to try to take the highlights and darken them down to see how good they look. And then I'm going to take the underexposed image and I'm going to brighten it up and try to brighten up those shadows to see what sort of information I get. And then I'm going to take all of them and then I'm going to compare all of them to see how they look. And so if we enlarge these, what you'll see is that the overexposed image has some really weird yellows in the highlights. They turned kind of gold and they changed quite a bit. The red got very saturated, but if you look at the shadow photo of these two, you'll see that the one that was underexposed that I brightened in post-production, the left side of the screen, looks better. And so you are better off underexposing on this sensor because you are able to recover a lot of those highlights in the shadows. So be careful not to overexposure because you can very easily brighten the dark areas of the images with this camera. It's got a very good sensor in that regard. All right, so that is our ISO options. Next up, let's talk about our shutter speed dial. So that's the other big dial on the top of the camera. And like the ISO dial, we have a similar style button on the top of this, where if we have it in the upward position, we can go ahead and turn the dial. Let's turn it here. And if you push it down, it will stay locked in that position. So right now we're going to leave it unlocked because we're going to be changing a number of things on it. Now, the back dial is going to be used with the shutter speed dial for a few things. So be aware that you might be changing the shutter speed dial or the back dial to make some of these changes. Let's take a closer look at that shutter speed dial. First up is automatic, and this is where the camera will choose the shutter speed for you, and it'll do it according to the light conditions. If you got a lot of light, you're going to end up with faster shutter speeds, and under low light, it goes down to slower shutter speeds. Next up, we have 8,000th of a second. It says 8,000, but it's actually a fraction 1/8,000th of a second. And then we're going to dial through our main aperture settings. So these are in full stops. There is an X behind the 250 because that is the maximum sync for flash. And we'll often see X used for denoting the flash synchronization speed. So that's the fastest speed with a TTL flash unit. Then we continue on down with the shutter speeds down to 1 full second, no longer the fraction. Everything else is a fraction. Now in between are the third stops on the shutter speeds. And so this is where you use the rear dial to control the specific shutter speeds. Let me show you real quickly on the camera. Let me go ahead and turn the camera on. Let's see if we can dial to a reasonable exposure here. Get this lined up just a bit here. Okay, we'll call this pretty close to good. And so with our shutter speeds, you can see them listed down here in blue. And I have the camera set to 125, 250, 500. And let's say I wanted to get to one of those third stop differences. I could dial to 200 and 160 from the 250 mark. And if I come down to 125, I can go to 160 and 200 as well. So with each shutter speed change, you can go 1 click, 2 clicks, and that's it. And then 1 click, 2 clicks in the other direction. So with each whole shutter speed that you get to, you can adjust by 1/3, 2/3 in either direction from that. And so if you don't like that, you can put it to the T mode, which I'm going to explain here in a second, and you can just select shutter speeds as you want with the back dial. So a little bit of a funky way of doing things, a little bit different than most people. So there's our T. That stands for time. It's for long and very specific shutter speeds. And so if you want to get to the third stops, you want to go all the way from the longest to the fastest, you can do that with the T. So if we look on the back of the camera, you'll see that we can get to our fastest shutter speed, currently at 8,000th of a second. Hint, there's something more coming there. And we can go down, I'm going to cover the lens so that this doesn't get blown out, down to our full second right there. That's a little quotation mark there indicating full seconds. And we get down to the normal, this is usually the longest shutter speed that you're going to find in most cameras is 30 seconds. But on this camera, it just keeps going all the way down to 15 minutes. You rarely want to use that, but it is good for some nighttime photography. So we're going to keep bumping this back up to a normal range. And so there we are. So that is some of your shutter speed setting there. Now, one of the other options is a B mode, and this stands for bulb. And this is long shutter speeds up to 60 minutes. Now, the way the bulb works is that it will keep the shutter open as long as your finger is pressing down on the shutter release. And this is where a cable release can really come in handy, whether it's the mechanical style or an electronic one that you can also connect up to the camera. It stays open as long as you keep that pressed in, and then you release it, and that ends the exposure. This can be good when you want to leave the shutter open for a long period of time, but you don't know how long. It depends on what happens during the exposure. So it's a fun nighttime experimentation mode to use. Now there are a couple of more shutter speeds that are faster than 1/8,000th of a second, going up to 32,000th of a second, and this will become something that's available when you turn on the electronic shutter speeds, which means that the camera is no longer using the mechanical shutter release in the camera, it's using an electronic means for turning the pixels on and off very quickly. It is something that we'll talk about a little bit later on in the menu section when we talk about the shutter type in there. But shutter speeds on their own are very important to know and understand for stopping motion and controlling light. You need 1,000th of a second, for instance, to stop something that's moving quickly like a bird in flight. Sometimes it's nice to have slow shutter speeds for showing motion. The bulb mode can be very handy in nighttime photography when you want to do light painting, as the cars are painting with the light here. So that is the basics of setting your shutter speeds. A lot going on in there. Okay, next up, we're going to be looking at the aperture settings. So most all of the lenses from Fuji will have an aperture ring on it, but not all of them. And so lenses that have an R in the designation after the aperture setting are ones that have an aperture ring in there. They do make some inexpensive lenses, maybe they're consumer lenses, that have an XC designation to them. They do not have an aperture control, in which case you'll need to use a dial on the camera to control the aperture. But most lenses will have an aperture ring on it that is very natural and traditional in style, very easy to change. Some of them, like this one, do not have any aperture indications as far as what aperture it is. It'll read it out electronically. Other lenses will have the numbers on there. It depends on whether the aperture is a fixed maximum aperture lens or if it's a variable. This one has a varying maximum aperture, and so they're not able to put those numbers on this particular lens. Now, these R lenses may have one of two different styles for using an automatic aperture system. And this one uses a switch. Let me swing it around so you can see it here. And so there's a switch over here where you can put the camera into automatic apertures, so the camera figures things out, or a manual one. Other lenses will have a labeled setting on the lens for putting it into that A setting. And so you'll have to take a look at your lenses to see which style you have if you have an R lens. Now, if you do not have an R lens, you have an XC lens, you'll be able to change your apertures with the back dial of the camera. Apertures are important, of course, for not only controlling the light, but controlling the depth of field. If you need a lot of depth of field, you'll need to stop down to f11, 16, or 22 or more. If you want to keep your subject separated from the background, you may want to use a very shallow depth of field, 1.4, f2, 2.8, something in that region in there. And so aperture controls are pretty easy on this camera. Let's just do a quick little demo on this. Let me just make a few other adjustments to make sure our camera's set up. I'm gonna set this manually here. And so you can see our aperture numbers are changing, as is changing our light right there. There's not a lot we can do with this one. On this camera, we can flip it into the automatic aperture mode. And then as we change shutter speeds, the aperture does change with us. Pretty simple. Nice, easy, straightforward. All right, now one of the things to know about is that if you do press halfway down on the shutter release, it will stop the lens down. And so when you press halfway, you're going to hear a little click, click, and that means the aperture is closing and it's showing you how much depth of field you are getting at any one particular time. And that can be very handy to see how much is going to be in focus in a particular situation. And so just be aware that that's what that little noise is. It's the aperture closing down. All right, so if you want to put your camera into a program auto exposure mode, you'll set your shutter speed to A, you'll set your aperture to A. You can choose to put your ISO in automatic or not. That's your choice. But in this case, the camera will figure out the best shutter speed and aperture for you, and it will show you that information in the viewfinder and or the LCD monitor on the camera. So let's go ahead and get this camera set up into that mode. So we'll first set our shutter speeds to the A setting up here. And then on our lenses, we'll rotate this around so we can see what we're doing. And we're going to rotate the lens and put that onto an A setting right there. I'm going to leave it at ISO 800 on the ISO dial just to have that done. And then we'll point around to our subject here. And these are the automated settings that the camera is giving us here. Now, one of the things that you can do is you can turn the back dial to do what's called a program shift. And so this is where the camera will adjust shutter speeds and apertures within the range that it can handle. So let's just say I wanted a 1/30th of a second. Okay, I can dial in a 1/30th of a second, but if the lighting changes, it's going to drift a little bit. It doesn't totally lock it in, it just kind of gets it near there. If I wanted f16, let me go to f16, we're there. But if the lighting changes, it may or may not be able to keep that f16. It actually is doing a pretty good job right here. It's going to vary the shutter speed possibly just a bit more than the aperture in this particular case. And so something to be just aware of is that you can do this change with the back dial of the camera right there. And that'll allow you to kind of give your own custom input as to what the program should be in that particular case. So back dial for doing program shift. Now, one of the things to be aware of is that indicators in blue mean you are manually changing them. Indicators in red mean there's some sort of warning on the camera. And so there's a couple of situations where you might get this. And so right now, we have our camera set into the program mode, so they're all in white. Let me go ahead and take the apertures out. And so now I'm going to be able to select apertures myself. You'll notice they're in blue. And so I can go from one extreme to the other, and there's not really any issue with it. Let me flip it back to automatic, but let me try this with the shutter speed dial. So I'm setting the blue shutter speed dial, but you'll notice the apertures just went red. And that's because I selected a shutter speed that is too fast for the situation. Let's get it back normal. Okay, so we're okay with the white reading. And see, this lens has a maximum opening right around f4. And so if I go past it, it does go down to 3.6, but it can't go beyond it. It needs to get more than this. And so this lens is not going to work out in this situation. And if we go too fast, no lens would be workable in that situation. And so either we need to come back to an acceptable balance here, 125th at f4.0. If we really wanted 500th of a second, well, we could change our ISO until that stops being red. There we go. So we would have to bump our ISO up to 3200. And so you'll see these various settings according to whether you're adjusting them manually or not. And so you get those blue indicators that let you know that you're doing shutter speed and aperture all on your own. And so be aware of those colors in there, and if there's anything red, the camera's going to let you shoot a photo and it's not going to be properly exposed, but you know, you're in control of the exposure. So it's your job to pay attention in the LCD or the viewfinder whether you're getting any of those red indications or if those shutter speed apertures are appropriate to what you're doing. All right, the other dial on the top of the camera is our exposure compensation dial, and this is used for adjusting the exposure when we're in one of the automated modes. So in aperture priority, shutter priority, or full program mode, we can dial in up to 3 stops of underexposure or overexposure. But we can actually do a little bit more than that because we can go into the custom setting here and we can turn the front dial to go all the way up to 5 stops of exposure compensation. So let's take a look at the camera. We've got our dial right here on top. You normally want to keep that at 0. Now notably, this one does not have one of those little lock features on it. So you do have to be a little bit careful. It is kind of reset into the body, so you don't normally bump it. But overexposure, underexposure, and then our C setting here. And so if we do a C setting here in front, we can control our exposure. Now I will throw my apertures into in aperture priority mode. So I'm controlling the aperture. Let's go F8. And camera is figuring out shutter speeds. And now I am using the front dial to control the exposure compensation, which you can see here clearly on the left side of the frame. And I can go all the way up to 5 stops over and 5 stops under. My choice there. If I just want to use the dial itself, I can just use the dial and you can see that scale changes to plus and minus 3. And the most important thing about exposure compensation is always remembering to return it back to 0 when you are done. You don't want to leave it inadvertently in some place that it's not supposed to be. And so exposure compensation, very easy and very versatile on this camera. You can use it when any one of the main exposure settings is in automatic. Automatic shutter, automatic aperture, and automatic ISO. All right, manual exposure. So if you like to do things yourself, a lot of tactile controls on this camera. We have our ISO, shutter speeds on top. We have our aperture on the lens, easy to get to. We're going to take a look at the exposure indicator over on the left side of the viewfinder or the LCD. This will show us how far off we are exposed. And so the main indicators are full stops. We also have third stops so that we can be very exacting about our exposure. I like manual exposure because when I get things set up and I have a constant light source like the sun, middle of the day, I'm going to get consistent results. It's also really good when you're dealing with tricky lighting situations that metering might be difficult on the camera. And so if things are unusually dark or unusually light, it's very good to set manual exposure. That way you can do a few test shots, make sure things are good, and then commence on shooting and worry about focus, composure, and other things. So if we want to manually expose in our camera, let's go ahead and set this up. Let's say I'm on a tripod, which I am. Let's say I want to shoot at a low ISO, the best quality on this camera. I'm going to dial it down to 160. We can see that right over here. I'm going to want to have my aperture. Let's set it up at f11, but shutter speeds, this is all looking good because the shutter speeds happen to be in automatic. But if I want to do it myself, I can turn the shutter speed dial kind of close to where it looks. And then over here, we can see that we're a third stop underexposed according to the recommended settings. And so if we wanted to go with recommended settings, I could do this. Now this little prop box is kind of white. It is white, very white, maybe a little bit lighter than average gray. And so I might want to brighten that up by a third, or I can't go 2/3 because I'm just too close. So maybe I need to go to the next shutter speed here and come back down. And so if I decided that's where I really want to have it at, then I can take my photo, focus on my subject, and get my photo of my perfect exposure there. And so very easy system to use. It'll look pretty much identical when you look through the viewfinder. And it's a very fun camera to use in that regard because you do have these nice tactile controls. And for those of us who worked on older manual style cameras, it's very reminiscent of that and feels very, very natural. So it's easy to use. All right, next up is the metering system. So if you are wanting to do the camera, whether it's manually or automatically, the camera needs to read the light, and there's a few different patterns and ways that it can do it. So let's take a look at the metering options in this camera. So the multi-metering is probably the one that most people are going to keep on most of the time. It's a multi-segment metering system, uses 250 segments, and it's good in general mixed lighting conditions where you might have highlights and shadows. And this is where it compares and contrasts each box of this multi-frame and tries to see what the right proportion of light versus dark is in a particular situation. I leave my camera in the multi-mode virtually all the time. It's a very good system, and with digital being able to see results immediately afterwards, and with a mirrorless camera being able to see results beforehand, I really haven't had a reason to change it from there. But the camera does have some other modes. The center-weighted mode is a traditional mode that's been on cameras for many decades, and this is where it weights the information that it's reading towards the center of the frame, where your subject is likely to be. And so if you like that, we do have that option. Another valuable option, I think, is the spot metering, which allows you to read the light in a very small portion of the frame. And so it's just 2% of the area. If you have a subject that has an unusually bright or dark background, this is the way to get a proper light reading of a small subject within the frame. There's also an average, which is just kind of a nice big entire frame area of it. It's going to work in some situations potentially better, but I think the multi-system is going to work best for most people most of the time. And that can be changed with the top button on the selector on the back of the camera. And so we're going to find that these buttons can be reprogrammed, but right now, if we'll go ahead and do a quick little demo, you'll see that if you just press up on that button, you can turn into the metering system and you can select which one you want, select it, and then press OK, and it's locked in. Go in and change it anytime you want like that. So very simple to access, and if you don't like to access it there, we will see it in the menu system. I believe we're going to see it in the quick menu, and it can be reassigned to another button if you don't like that. Another great way for making sure that you get the right exposure is by using a histogram on the camera. And this can be displayed by hitting the display button a number of times so that you can see the histogram. And the histogram will show you if you are underexposed, correctly exposed, or overexposed. And in very simplistic short terms, a mountain in the middle is generally what you want to see for subjects that are normally of average brightness, shall we say. Now, you'll notice that if you try to do this on your camera, it's not going to work. That's because it's not turned on. So let's dive into the menu and turn this particular feature on so that you can do it. So normally we would just press this display button back here and it would change the displays. And yes, there is a histogram there, but I want to see it while I see my subject. And I don't see it here. So that's because we need to go into the menu. And in this particular case, we're going to go down to the Setup menu, and we're going to go to Screen Setup. And when we go in here, you'll notice up at the top it says page 1 of 3. We need to go down to the 3rd page and find something called Display Custom Setting. And we're going to go to the right here. And there's going to be all these different options in here. But what we want is the histogram. And so we're going to give that a little checkbox. We're going to look at the rest of this more closely later. And we're going to back out of this. And now we're back here and boom, there we got our histogram. We don't want it, we can turn it off. So as we cycle through the display options, we now have that histogram in there. And let's go ahead and change some exposures so you can see that histogram working in real time. And so you can see as we get overexposed, it moves to the right. And as we move to the left, it starts getting stacked up against the left-hand side. And so where it should be is generally you want things away from the walls. I jumped through too long a shutter speed there. And so we can move it around. And if we want to just looking at the histogram, not even the numbers, I'm going to say that too dark, pretty good. It looks a little too light. So somewhere right about here, we're recording all of our information in the middle of this sensor. And that means we're not getting blown out pixels that are too bright, or nor are we getting shadow areas that are too dark that will not have quality information in on it. So it's a great tool, being able to see it in the viewfinder while you are looking at the image. It's better than the light meter. It gives you a lot more information. The light meter is just one indicator of where the exposure is at. This is showing you not only where the exposure is at, but where the extremes are at, where the brightness and the darkness areas are at. So something I would recommend leaving turned on. Another little tool we have is called Auto Exposure Lock. And so there is a button on the back of the camera called AEL. And this works when you are in an automated exposure mode. So let's go ahead and put this camera, I'm going to put it into automatic shutter speeds right now. And so I do have my shutter speed on A. I'm going to bump it up to 400 here because we got a little bit lower light here in the studio. And I can manually adjust my aperture right here. All right, so if I'm looking at my exposure and I kind of move to the left and right a little bit, you can see that my shutter speed changes. Okay, you can see how it drops down because it gets darker over there. And so if I said, you know what, I want to lock a 1/15 of a second in, I can press the AEL button, and you'll notice that it actually chooses the exact shutter speed that it needs. And so it's saying 13, but it's actually jumping to 14. And as I reposition the camera here, I can then, as I leave my finger on the button, I can take a photo, and it will select that specific shutter speed that we were at 1/14 of a second. And so this can work good in situations where the light varies quite a bit and you just want to lock it in for a moment. You can use that button. Now, depending on how you work, you may never use this button, and that's fine because we're going to be able to go in and customize this button the way it works later on. Now, if you do want it to use as an auto exposure lock button in here, there is a custom setting within the button dial menu where you can choose that it is a toggle switch, which means you press it, it stays on, and then you press it again, it turns off, or it's a press and hold button. That's the way that I demoed it, and that's the way it normally is. But if you want it to be a switch that stays locked on without your finger on it, you can do that. If you want to completely reprogram it, you can go into the function settings and assign a different function to that particular button. Another tool for making sure that you have the correct exposure is exposure bracketing. Now this is going to be located over on the drive dial that we will talk about also in the drive section. And this is where the camera will shoot a series of photos that vary in their exposure. And this is for two reasons. One, if you're not sure what the right exposure is and you just want to get one image correct, but you're not sure which one while you're out in the field, you can shoot several photos and pick the right one later. Or for people who are doing HDR, high dynamic range photography, and they want to shoot a collection of photographs that they will compile and process together into one final image. So different reasons why you might want to do it, but this is how we're going to do it. So let's talk a little bit about some of the capabilities of this. So when you get in here, you can shoot anywhere from 2 to 9 frames, depending on how wide of latitude of range you're wanting to cover. You can also cover different exposure increments. You can go from a third stop, which is a very small adjustment, one image to the next, all the way up to 3 stops between the images. Most people doing a traditional bracket would do 1 full stop. There's a nice notable bit of difference between 1 full stop. You can have it set to 1 frame or continuous. So do you want to shoot 1 series of images, or do you want to continually shoot in bracketing? Most of the time, people who are using this just occasionally will want to do 1 frame because that way it won't stay in the bracketing mode. You can also change the sequence of bracketing. Normally, the camera shoots the normal exposure first, and then the lighter ones, and then the darker ones. But when you look at a whole bunch of bracketed images, it becomes kind of a big mess of images where it's hard to tell where one began and one ended. And so there's a number of photographers that like changing the sequence so that it shoots the lightest one first and then shoots the darkest one, or darkest to the lightest. That way it's very clear when you're shooting 1 series of bracketed images and another and another and another, which group they're in. And so those are going to be some of the options. Let's go ahead and set this camera into the bracketing mode. So on the back of the camera, we need to turn this dial to the bracketing mode here. I'm going to get our camera turned on. Now on the front of the camera, there is a button up here, and this is kind of our subsetting. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to hide that from you right now so that you can see what's going on the back of the camera. And that kind of opens up the options into the bracketing setting that we have up here set. And so we can just press that button, actually just press the shutter release to kick out of it, press the button to go in. Let's go in and set up the frames and steps. All right, we will do 3 frames, but rather than 1/3 stops, we are going to do, normally I would do 1 step, but I want to make it really clear for you, so we're going to do it in 2 steps. So I'm going to set that. 1 frame continuous. I'm going to set this at 1 frame, and I'm going to have this shoot not 0 first. I want it to go minus dark, then normal, and then light. Okay, so I am in aperture or automatic shutter speed, so that's the shutter speed that's going to vary. Let me get my aperture set right. I want to get it set to f8. We can see on the back there f8. And it looks very dark because this is the first of our bracketed series. We're going to shoot 3 photos. This one, I think, is going to be the dark one. You can see over here on the left the bracket that we're doing, 0, +2, and -2. 1, 2, and 3. So if I play these images back, we can see right here, this one's the +2, that one's the ±0, and there's our -2. And so I'm going to do this again, but I'm going to do it in a slightly different way. I'm going to press the button on the front of the camera. And so once again, I'm just going to press this button here, and it brings up this little menu in the back. And in this case, I'm going to do 5 frames. I'll leave it at 2 stops because that's, actually, I'm going to do it at 1 stop because I'm planning on doing something else. So we do it 5 frames. Rather than 1 frame, I'm going to do continuous. I'll leave it in the same minus to dark. Now what's going to happen is I'm going to press down on the shutter release in the continuous mode. The camera's going to shoot through all 5 photos automatically very quickly. And I just want to double check my settings here. I have 5 1 step apart, looking good. You can see it over here on the left, and here we go. And it shot through everything right there. So let's take a look at what we got. Our +2, +1, 0, -1, and -2. All right, I'm happy with that. So I'm going to take it out of the bracketing mode so I don't shoot any more bracketing accidentally when I don't know about it. So it's a good tool whether you want to just find the right exposure or you're going to be using all of those images to compile it later for an HDR setting. Next up, the camera has high dynamic range built into the camera. And so on the drive mode, you can set it over into the HDR setting. You can set any subsettings down here on the front button of the camera, and you can set this to shoot either 200, 400, 800, or 800% plus. What the camera is going to do is it's going to shoot through 3 photos at different exposures, and it's going to compile it into a final photo. And I'm always a little dubious about a camera that tries to do too much, and HDR is a very complex processing system, so I wanted to throw it through my own test. And so I got 2 playing cards here, one's in the brights and one's in the shadows, and I set the camera to do HDR in each of these different modes to see how much of it does. And as you can see, as you get to the higher numbers, we're able to see more into the shadow areas, and the more the highlights are kind of pulled back. If we look at the histograms, look what happens to the bright side, the highlights on the histograms as we go up in numbers. It's pulling back that highlight information. And if we look at the shadows, it's pulling those shadows away from the dark areas so that you can see more into the shadows. And so it does allow you to see a little bit more information. So then I wanted to compare, well, what if I just shot a JPEG image and I adjusted it in Photoshop or Lightroom or some other program, and I tried to lighten up the shadows and pull back the highlights? Yeah, kind of the same thing. And so while it does have built-in HDR, I don't think it does a phenomenal job. It might save you the time and effort in working in a post-production software. If you don't have a computer, you don't have that software, you can do it in camera, and that's kind of nice because you get an image straight out of the camera that has those adjustments to it. So it's a feature that can work for some people, but I don't think it really gives you better results than just doing something manually yourself. One thing to be aware of though, when you do use this mode, they did kind of design it for people to use the camera handheld. It's better if you use it on a tripod because with multiple photos, things should remain lined up. But it crops in on your image a little bit, so you're going to lose a little bit with your wide-angle lenses, kind of notably losing that angle of view. You lose it with all of them, but it just becomes kind of more important with wide-angle lenses usually. And so not a mode that I'm going to recommend for most people that often, but if you want to experiment with it, enjoy. It's there. It does serve a purpose for some reasons. All right, so that's a rundown of all the different exposure controls in the camera. Hopefully you got a real good idea on how those work, and we've got a ton more because the next big section is on focus, and there is a whole bunch more of equally important functions that we need to talk about in there.